The massive hands that could bend iron like twigs trembled as they pushed the delicate gold wedding band back across the rough wooden counter. Eleanor's face crumpled, her last shred of hope dissolving like morning mist over the desert mountains. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hammering echoes from the forge. "It's all I have left." The giant blacksmith's weathered face hardened, his steel-gray eyes avoiding hers. Something dangerous flickered behind his expression. Not anger, but something far more complicated. Something that would change both their lives forever. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. But to understand why Thomas McKenna, the most feared and respected man in Dusty Creek, would make the decision that shocked the entire town, we need to go back 3 days earlier. 3 days before this moment, when a bone-thin woman in a tattered blue dress stumbled into the dusty main street of Dusty Creek, Montana, clutching a carpet bag in the hand of a silent, hollow-eyed boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The merciless August sun beat down on the wooden sidewalks, and tumbleweeds danced across the dirt road like ghostly dancers. Eleanor Whitmore's Eastern leather boots, once fine and polished, now cracked and worn through at the soles, left small spots of blood with each painful step. Her dark hair, which had once been pinned in perfect Boston fashion, hung in limp strands around her gaunt face. The town seemed to hold its breath as she passed. Conversations stopped. Curtains twitched. Even the horses at the hitching posts seemed to sense the desperation that clung to her like smoke from a dying fire. She had traveled for 2 weeks on the railroad, spending her last dollars on the cheapest tickets available. The telegram that had brought her here, the one promising a teaching position at the local school, lay crumpled in her bag alongside the discovered truth. The position had been filled months ago. The telegram had been a cruel hoax, though by whom and why, she would never know. Little Samuel, her late husband's nephew, whom she'd been caring for since his parents died in a fire back in Ohio, hadn't spoken a word since they left the train station. His small hand in hers was the only warm thing in a world that had grown impossibly cold. Eleanor's stomach cramped with a hunger she'd never experienced in her previous life as the wife of a respected bank clerk. That life seemed like a dream now, a dream that had ended with James's sudden death from pneumonia and the discovery that his business partner had embezzled everything, leaving her with debts instead of inheritance. The scent of fresh bread from Henderson's general store made her knees weak. Through the window, she could see golden loaves cooling on wooden shelves, and her mouth watered despite her pride. She had 53 cents left to her name and nowhere to go. The next train east wouldn't come for 4 days, and she couldn't afford the tickets anyway. As the sun began its descent toward the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Eleanor realized she had only one option left. Her wedding ring, the simple gold band James had placed on her finger 5 years ago in a small church in Boston, was the only thing of value she still possessed. The decision to approach the blacksmith shop had been born of pure desperation, but Eleanor couldn't have predicted the strange rumors that swirled around Thomas McKenna like smoke from his forge. "He's been alone for nigh on 8 years," she'd overheard Mrs. Henderson whisper to another woman outside the general store. "Ever since that terrible business with his wife and daughter. Some say he's gone half mad with grief. Others say he's just waiting for the right reason to use that gun of his again." Eleanor pushed these warnings from her mind as she approached the massive stone and timber building that housed McKenna's forge. The sound of hammer on anvil rang out with rhythmic precision, and orange light flickered through the open doors like a glimpse into Hades itself. She had never seen a man so large. Thomas McKenna stood at least 6.5 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His arms, bared to the elbow and gleaming with sweat, moved the heavy hammer with an ease that spoke of years of hard labor. Dark hair, streaked with early silver despite his apparent youth, fell across his forehead as he worked. When he noticed Eleanor standing in the doorway, he set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and she felt an unexpected shiver run down her spine, not of fear, but of something else entirely. Ma'am, he said simply, his voice deep and gravelly. Something I can do for you? Eleanor's prepared speech died in her throat. Up close, she could see that Thomas McKenna was perhaps 35 years old, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the deep lines of pain etched around his eyes and mouth. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and she found herself wondering what battles this man had fought. I, I was hoping you might be willing to purchase something from me, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. For food money. Samuel pressed closer to her skirts, and she felt the weight of his trust like a physical thing. Whatever pride she had left would have to be sacrificed for his sake. Thomas's eyes moved to the boy, then back to Eleanor's face. She saw something flicker there. Recognition, perhaps of desperation he had once known himself. What you got? He asked quietly. Eleanor's hand trembled as she worked the gold band from her finger. It slipped off easily now. She had lost so much weight during their journey that her hands looked like bird bones wrapped in pale skin. It's not much, she said, placing the ring on his workbench, but it's real gold. My late husband gave it to me. I know it's not worth much, but I was hoping maybe enough for some bread and milk for the boy. Thomas picked up the ring, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he examined it. The gold caught the light from the forge, and Eleanor could see him reading the inscription inside. Forever, my love. J.W. Your husband's been dead long, he asked without looking up. 6 months, Eleanor replied. We came here because I thought I had a letter about a teaching position. But it wasn't real. And now, she gestured helplessly. Thomas set the ring down and studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see through her carefully maintained composure to the fear and desperation beneath. You got any family back east? He asked. Eleanor shook her head. Just Samuel and me now. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the forge and the distant sounds of the town settling into evening. Eleanor held her breath, knowing that this moment would determine whether she and Samuel would eat tonight or if they would be spending another hungry night under the stars. But Thomas McKenna was about to make a decision that would surprise them both. Thomas McKenna stared at the gold ring in his palm and felt something crack inside his chest. Something that had been frozen solid for 8 long years. The woman standing in his forge reminded him of someone he'd tried desperately to forget. Not in appearance, his Mary had been blonde and sturdy, built for frontier life, but in the way she held herself despite obvious defeat. The same quiet dignity he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Ma'am, he said finally, I got a proposition for you. Eleanor's head snapped up, hope flickering in her dark eyes like candlelight in a storm. I ain't had a decent meal in a long while, Thomas continued, the words feeling strange on his tongue. He hadn't spoken this much to another person in months. My cabin's got 2 rooms, and the back room's got its own entrance. You and the boy could stay there, and you could cook, clean if you've a mind to, in exchange for room and board. Eleanor's mouth opened slightly, and he could see her mind racing, weighing options she didn't have. I wouldn't expect nothing improper, he added quickly, heat rising in his face. Just practical help, and you'd keep your ring. Samuel tugged at Eleanor's skirt and whispered something Thomas couldn't hear. She knelt down to the boy's level and spoke softly to him, her voice too quiet for Thomas to make out the words. The intimacy of the moment, the gentle way she smoothed the child's hair, the way he leaned into her touch, hit Thomas like a physical blow. Mary used to do that with Emma, he thought, then pushed the memory away before it could tear him apart again. Eleanor stood slowly, her decision made. Mr. McKenna, I appreciate your offer more than I can say, but I must ask, why would you help strangers? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the forge. Thomas could have given her a dozen different answers, all of them true, because she reminded him of better times. Because the boy's hollow eyes looked too much like his own reflection. Because the loneliness in his cabin had grown so thick he could barely breathe through it anymore. Instead, he said simply, because I can. Eleanor extended her hand to him, a formal gesture that seemed absurdly civilized in the rough surroundings of the forge. Her palm was soft against his calloused fingers. and he was careful not to grip too tightly. "Then we accept, Mr. McKenna. Thank you." "Thomas," he corrected. "And you are?" "Eleanor Whitmore. This is Samuel." The boy peered up at Thomas from behind Eleanor's skirts, and Thomas felt his breath catch. Samuel had eyes the exact shade of blue as Emma's had been, that clear, innocent blue of summer skies. "Well then, Mrs. Whitmore," Thomas said, his voice rougher than he intended, "let's get you both fed." As they walked through the gathering dust toward his cabin, Thomas found himself stealing glances at Eleanor. She moved with careful grace despite her obvious exhaustion, and she kept one protective hand on Samuel's shoulder at all times. The boy stayed close to her, but Thomas noticed the way his eyes darted around, taking in everything: the horses, the buildings, the mountains in the distance. Smart kid, Thomas thought, knows to watch his surroundings. The cabin Thomas led them to was larger than Eleanor had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney and a wide front porch. It sat on a small rise overlooking the town, with the forge and Thomas's workshop visible down the slope. Behind it, the land stretched toward rolling hills dotted with cattle. "Built it myself," Thomas said, noting her surprise. Was supposed to house a family." He didn't elaborate, but Eleanor heard the weight of old pain in his voice. She had become an expert at recognizing grief. It took one to know one. The interior was sparse but clean, with sturdy furniture that showed the same careful craftsmanship as the building itself. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the kitchen, while basic, was well equipped. The back room Thomas had mentioned was small but comfortable, with a single bed and a cot that would be perfect for Samuel. "I'll get you some supplies from town tomorrow," Thomas said, avoiding their eyes. "For now." He moved to the pantry and emerged with bread, cheese, and a jar of preserves. "It ain't much." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched him slice the bread with careful precision. When was the last time someone had shown her such simple kindness? As they ate by lamplight, Samuel slowly began to relax, even managing a small smile when Thomas carved him a tiny horse from a scrap of wood. Eleanor found herself studying their benefactor's face in the golden light, wondering what tragedy had carved those lines of sorrow around his eyes. She had no idea that by morning she would discover the first clue to the mystery that has surrounded Thomas McKenna, and that her presence in his life was about to awaken dangers neither of them could imagine. Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of hammer striking anvil, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth. She had slept better than she had in weeks, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Samuel was still curled up on his cot, finally looking peaceful for the first time since they'd left Ohio. The morning light filtering through the small window was golden and warm, nothing like the gray industrial haze she remembered from Boston. In the kitchen, she found a pot of coffee already brewing and a note written in Thomas's careful hand. "Gone to town for supplies. Help yourself to what you need. Back by noon. TM." Eleanor smiled despite herself. It had been a long time since anyone had thought to make coffee for her. As she explored the cabin more thoroughly in the morning light, she began to piece together fragments of Thomas McKenna's story. The house was built for a family. That much was obvious from the unused bedrooms upstairs, the large kitchen table, the toys carved from wood and left forgotten on shelves. But everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of a life interrupted. In the main bedroom, she found a woman's dress hanging in the wardrobe, covered with a sheet as if someone couldn't bear to look at it, but couldn't bring himself to put it away. On the mantelpiece, a daguerreotype showed Thomas with his arm around a blonde woman and a little girl with pigtails. All three of them were smiling. Eleanor stared at the photograph for a long moment, understanding flooding through her. The woman and child were beautiful, and the love between the three of them was evident even in the formal pose. Whatever had happened to them, it explained the haunted look in Thomas's eyes. She was still studying the photograph when she heard voices outside. Through the window, she could see Thomas returning from town with a wagon full of supplies. But he wasn't alone. A tall, lean man in an expensive suit was riding alongside him, and even from a distance, Eleanor could sense tension between them. "We told you before, McKenna," the well-dressed man was saying as they drew closer to the cabin. "That offer stands. Double what the land's worth, cash money. All you got to do is sign the papers." "And I told you, Dalton," Thomas replied, his voice deadly quiet. "I ain't selling." Eleanor moved away from the window quickly, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping, but she couldn't help overhearing the rest of their conversation. "You're being foolish," Dalton continued. "Man like you, living out here all alone, barely scraping by with that forge of yours. You could buy yourself a nice place in Denver, start over somewhere nobody knows your history." There was a long pause, and when Thomas spoke again, his voice had gone dangerously soft. "Maybe you ought to ride on back to town now, Dalton, before I forget my manners." Eleanor heard the jingle of harness and hoofbeats fading into the distance. A few minutes later, Thomas knocked on the door of the back room. "Mrs. Whitmore? I brought supplies." Eleanor emerged to find the kitchen table covered with packages: flour, sugar, salt, coffee, canned goods, and fresh meat wrapped in brown paper. It was more food than she and Samuel could eat in a month. "Mr. McKenna, Thomas, this is too generous," she protested. Thomas was already unloading another armful from the wagon. "Boy needs feeding up," he said gruffly. "You both do." Eleanor watched him work, noting the way his massive hands handled even the most delicate items with surprising care. She had grown up around educated men, professors, clerks, gentlemen who prided themselves on their refined manners. But there was something about Thomas McKenna's quiet competence that made her feel safer than she had in months. "Who was that man?" she asked before she could stop herself. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Nobody you need to worry about. He wanted to buy your land." "Jeremiah Dalton wants to buy every piece of property in this valley," Thomas said, setting down the last of the supplies with perhaps more force than necessary. "He's got big ideas about cattle ranching and railroad rights of way. Trouble is, not everyone's interested in selling." Eleanor heard something in his tone that made her look at him more closely. "But he's not giving up." "No," Thomas agreed, "he ain't." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. Eleanor found herself wondering what methods Jeremiah Dalton might use to persuade reluctant sellers, and why Thomas seemed so determined to resist what sounded like a generous offer. "Thomas," she said quietly, "if my being here puts you in any kind of danger—" "It don't," he interrupted, but his eyes didn't meet hers. "Dalton's all talk and bluster. Besides, you got nowhere else to go." It was true, but something about the way he said it made Eleanor's skin prickle with unease. She was beginning to understand that Thomas McKenna was a man with enemies, and by accepting his help, she and Samuel might have walked into the middle of a conflict they didn't understand. That evening, as she prepared their first real meal in the cabin's kitchen, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from the shadows beyond the windows, and that their troubles were just beginning. By the end of her first week at the McKenna cabin, Eleanor had established a routine that brought the household to life in ways it hadn't seen in years. She rose before dawn to start the coffee and prepare Thomas's breakfast. Thick slices of bacon, eggs from the chickens he kept behind the cabin, and biscuits that filled the kitchen with the warm smell of home. By the time he emerged from his room, already dressed for work in his leather apron and heavy boots, the table was set and waiting. Thomas ate in silence, but Eleanor had begun to notice the way his shoulders relaxed when he sat down to a proper meal, the almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when Samuel chattered about the wooden animals Thomas carved for him each evening. The boy was thriving. The hollow, frightened look was fading from his face, replaced by the natural curiosity of childhood. He followed Thomas around like a shadow when the blacksmith was working near the cabin, asking endless questions about horses and cattle and how to read the weather in the shape of clouds. "He's good with the boy," Eleanor confided to Mrs. Henderson when she made her weekly trip to the general store. "Patient in a way you wouldn't expect from such a imposing man." Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Thomas McKenna was the gentlest father you ever saw before—" She glanced around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "Before that terrible night. His little Emma used to ride on his shoulders down Main Street, proud as you please. And Mary, his wife, she had him wrapped around her little finger, despite all his size and strength." "What happened to them?" Eleanor asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Mrs. Henderson's face darkened. "Indian raid, spring of 1883. Thomas was in town, working late on some horseshoes for the cavalry unit passing through. By the time he got home, she shook her head. House was burned, Mary and Emma were gone. He tracked those Indians for 3 weeks, came back with blood on his hands and something dead in his eyes. Eleanor felt her stomach clench with sympathy and horror. That's terrible. Changed him completely, Mrs. Henderson continued. Used to be the most sociable man you could imagine. Now he barely speaks to anyone except when business requires it. Until you came along, that is. Eleanor paid for her purchases in thoughtful silence. As she walked back toward the cabin, she found herself seeing Thomas McKenna in a new light. The careful way he interacted with Samuel, the gentle carving of wooden toys, the patient answers to a curious boy's questions. These were the remnants of a father's love, awakening after years of dormancy. That afternoon, she was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she noticed a rider watching them from the ridge above. The man was too far away for her to make out his features, but something about his stillness made her uneasy. When she looked again, a few minutes later, he was gone. She mentioned it to Thomas that evening as he sat on the front porch, smoking his pipe and watching Samuel play with a wooden horse and rider. Probably just someone passing through, Thomas said. But Eleanor noticed the way his eyes scanned the surrounding hills, alert and watchful. Thomas, Eleanor said carefully, that man who came here last week, Dalton. Mrs. Henderson says he's been buying up properties all through the valley. Thomas's pipe went still in his hands. What else does Mrs. Henderson say? That some folks are happy to sell, but others, Eleanor hesitated. Others have had their minds changed for them. Meaning? Fires mostly, accidents that happened to destroy barns and outbuildings right around the time Dalton made his offers. And there was a family, the Kowalskis, who had their cattle poisoned after they refused to sell. Thomas set down his pipe and looked at Eleanor directly. In the fading light, his face was hard as carved stone. You thinking of leaving? He asked quietly. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest at the thought. In just 1 week, this place had begun to feel more like home than anywhere she'd lived since childhood. Samuel was happy, she was useful, and despite the lingering sadness that clung to Thomas like morning mist, she found herself looking forward to their quiet evenings together. I'm thinking, she said carefully, that if someone's trying to drive you off your land, maybe you shouldn't face it alone. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw surprise flicker in his storm-gray eyes. You don't know what you're saying, he said finally. I got things in my past, Eleanor. Things that could put you and the boy in danger just by being associated with me. We're already in danger, Eleanor replied. Samuel and I have nowhere else to go, and you've shown us more kindness than we had any right to expect. If trouble comes, we'll face it together. Samuel looked up from his playing, sensing the seriousness in the adults' voices. Are we staying, Aunt Eleanor? Eleanor looked at the boy's trusting face, then at Thomas's scarred features and storm-cloud eyes. Yes, she said firmly, we're staying. But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just signed all 3 of their names to a declaration of war. The attack came on a moonless night in September, swift and silent as death itself. Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of Thomas's boots thundering across the cabin floor. Through her window, she could see orange flames licking at the walls of his workshop and dark figures moving like shadows between the buildings. Eleanor! Thomas's voice was sharp with urgency. Get the boy and get down to the root cellar. Now! Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she scooped Samuel from his cot. The boy was still half asleep, confused and frightened by the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting voices outside. What's happening? Samuel whispered against her shoulder. Just a fire, sweetheart, Eleanor lied, though she could hear men's voices now, harsh and demanding, coming closer to the cabin. The root cellar was built into the hillside behind the house, its heavy wooden door concealed by overgrown vines. Thomas had shown it to her during her first week, mentioning casually that it stayed cool in summer and was good for storing food. Now she understood its true purpose. Stay here no matter what you hear, Thomas commanded, pressing a loaded rifle into her hands. You know how to use this? Eleanor's father had taught her to shoot when she was Samuel's age, despite her mother's protests. Yes. Good. Thomas's face was grim in the flickering light from the burning workshop. If anyone comes down here who ain't me, you shoot first and ask questions later. Before Eleanor could respond, he was gone, melting into the shadows with the deadly grace of a man who had learned to hunt and be hunted. From the cellar, Eleanor could hear the sounds of conflict above, shouts, the crash of breaking glass, the sharp crack of gunfire. Samuel pressed against her side, trembling, and she wrapped her arm around him while keeping the rifle ready with her free hand. "McKenna!" a voice called out, harsh and mocking. "You in there, McKenna? We got a business proposition for you." Eleanor recognized the cultured tones of Jeremiah Dalton, though his voice carried a viciousness she hadn't heard during his previous visit. "Your workshop's already gone," Dalton continued. "Be ashamed if your pretty cabin went up too. And that woman and boy you got staying with you? Well, accidents happen in fires. Sometimes folks don't make it out." The threat against her and Samuel hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She tightened her grip on the rifle, her father's lessons flooding back. Breathe steady, sight down the barrel, squeeze, don't pull. Above them, she heard Thomas's voice, deadly calm. "You made a mistake coming here tonight, Dalton." "Did I? You're one man against six. Even you ain't that good anymore." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. 6 men, and Thomas facing them alone. She thought of his gentle hands carving toys for Samuel, his careful way of preparing coffee each morning, the haunted look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The sound of gunfire erupted suddenly, sharp and violent in the night air. Eleanor pulled Samuel closer and prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. The battle seemed to last forever, though it was probably only minutes. Eleanor heard running footsteps, more shots, the sound of horses moving fast across the rocky ground. Then gradually, silence. She waited, counting her heartbeats, listening for any sound that would tell her whether Thomas was alive or dead. Samuel had gone very still in her arms, and she could feel his tears soaking through her nightgown. Finally, she heard footsteps approaching the cellar door, slow, heavy, uneven. "Eleanor?" Thomas's voice was rough with pain and exhaustion. "It's me. You can come out." Eleanor emerged from the cellar to find Thomas leaning heavily against the cabin wall, one hand pressed to his left shoulder where blood seeped between his fingers. His face was pale, but his eyes were alive, fierce with adrenaline and something darker. "Are you hurt?" she asked, setting Samuel down and moving to examine Thomas's wound. "Just a graze," Thomas said, though the amount of blood suggested otherwise. "Dalton and his boys are gone, for now." Eleanor helped him into the cabin, noting the way he favored his left side and the tightness around his eyes that spoke of significant pain. The kitchen was undamaged, but she could see bullet holes in the walls and smell the acrid scent of gunpowder. "Samuel, can you bring me that bottle of whiskey from the pantry?" Eleanor asked, settling Thomas into a chair. "And the clean towels from the washstand." As she cleaned and bandaged Thomas's wound, Eleanor felt something fundamental shift inside her. The civilized woman from Boston, the one who had never seen violence, who had lived her life in drawing rooms and libraries, was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who could tend bullet wounds without flinching and plan for the next attack without breaking down. "They'll be back," Thomas said quietly, watching her work. "Dalton don't like to lose." "Then we'll be ready," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice. Thomas studied her face in the lamplight, and Eleanor saw something like admiration flicker in his storm-gray eyes. "This ain't your fight, Eleanor. You and the boy could still leave, head back east where it's safe." Eleanor finished tying off the bandage and met his gaze directly. "We're not going anywhere, Thomas McKenna. This is our home now, and we'll fight for it." Outside, the workshop continued to burn, sending sparks into the star-filled sky like fallen angels, and Eleanor knew that the war for their future had only just begun. In the cold light of dawn, the extent of the damage became clear. Thomas's workshop was nothing but charred timber and twisted metal. Years of careful craftsmanship reduced to ash and memory. Eleanor stood in the ruins, Samuel's small hand tight in hers, watching Thomas poke through the wreckage with the end of a long iron rod. His left arm was still in a sling, but his face showed more anger than pain as he surveyed what remained of his livelihood. "Can it be rebuilt?" Eleanor asked quietly. Thomas lifted a hammer from the debris, his father's hammer, he told her once, passed down through 3 generations of blacksmiths. The handle was charred, but the head was intact, still solid and true. "Everything can be rebuilt," Thomas said, his voice rough with determination. "Question is whether Dalton will let us." As if summoned by his name, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road. Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to the pistol she now wore at her hip. Thomas had insisted she carry it at all times, but the riders approaching weren't Dalton's men. Sheriff Jake Morrison rode at the head of a small group of townspeople, his weathered face grim as he took in the destruction. Behind him, Eleanor recognized Mrs. Henderson, Doc Warner, and several other merchants from town. "Hell of a thing, Thomas," the sheriff said, dismounting slowly. He was an old man, past 60, with arthritis in his joints and a reputation for avoiding confrontation whenever possible. "You got any idea who might have done this?" Thomas's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You know damn well who did this, Jake." "Now I can't go making accusations without proof," Morrison replied, but his eyes wouldn't meet Thomas's. "Could have been drifters, or maybe some of them Indians from the reservation, looking for trouble." "Indians?" Thomas's voice was deadly quiet. "Jake, you know what Indians do to my family. You think I wouldn't recognize the difference between Indians and white men with torches?" Eleanor saw several of the townspeople shift uncomfortably. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "Sheriff Morrison, everyone knows Jeremiah Dalton's been pressuring folks to sell," she said firmly. "And everyone knows what happens to those who refuse. The Kowalski barn, the Petersons' cattle, and now this." "Mrs. Henderson," Morrison interrupted, "I'd be careful about spreading rumors. Mr. Dalton's a respected businessman with interests throughout the territory. Making accusations without proof could be considered slander." Eleanor felt anger flare in her chest like the embers of the burned workshop. The sheriff's refusal to even investigate was more than cowardice. It was complicity. "What about the bullet holes in our cabin?" she asked, stepping forward. "Or the threats made against me and the boy? Are those rumors too?" Morrison's eyes flicked to Eleanor, and she saw something ugly in his expression. Dismissal mixed with something that might have been lust. "Ma'am, frontier life can be dangerous. Maybe you'd be safer heading back to whatever city you came from." Thomas moved forward, and despite his injured arm, there was something in his posture that made the sheriff take an involuntary step back. "Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice carrying the promise of Paulun, "Mrs. Whitmore and the boy are under my protection. Anyone who threatens them, anyone at all, answers to me." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, and Eleanor could feel the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Finally, Morrison looked away. "I'll file a report," he said without conviction. "But like I said, without witnesses or proof." Doc Warner, who had been examining the burn workshop with professional interest, suddenly called out from near the forge. "Thomas, you might want to see this." They gathered around the doctor, who was kneeling beside something half buried in the ash. With careful hands, he brushed away the debris to reveal a piece of metal, part of a spur, with distinctive silver inlay work. "Fancy piece," Doc Warner observed. "Custom made, I'd say. Not the kind of thing a drifter or reservation Indian would be wearing." Thomas picked up the spur fragment and examined it closely. Eleanor saw recognition flicker in his eyes. "You know whose it is," she said quietly. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I know." Sheriff Morrison reached for the spur, but Thomas closed his fist around it before the lawman could take it. "Evidence," Thomas said coldly. "Thought you said you needed proof." The sheriff's face flushed red, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Well, well, what have we here?" Everyone turned to see Jeremiah Dalton riding up the path, flanked by two of his men. He was impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his suit clean and pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Only Eleanor, watching carefully, noticed a slight stiffness in his movements that suggested he too had been in a fight the night before. "Terrible thing, this fire," Dalton said with false sympathy, his pale eyes taking in the destruction. "I heard about it in town and came right out to see if there was anything I could do to help." The casual arrogance of the man made Eleanor's blood boil. Here he stood, surveying the damage his men had done, offering help with the same breath he'd used to threaten murder the night before. Thomas took a step forward, the spur fragment still clenched in his fist, and Eleanor saw Dalton's eyes flick to the movement. "That's mighty generous of you, Dalton," Thomas said, his voice deceptively calm, "especially considering how busy you must have been last night." Dalton's smile never wavered, but Eleanor caught the flash of something dangerous in his pale eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, McKenna. I was in my hotel room all evening, playing poker with several prominent citizens. Sheriff Morrison can verify that, I'm sure." The trap was neatly laid, and Eleanor watched Morrison nod reluctantly. Of course Dalton would have an alibi, probably paid for with gold or promises of political advancement. But as she studied Dalton's face, Eleanor noticed something the others had missed: a small cut on his left cheek, still fresh and what looked like powder burns on the back of his right hand. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. 3 weeks after the fire, Eleanor discovered that war could be fought with ledger books as well as guns. She was in Henderson's general store, purchasing supplies for the slow work of rebuilding, when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Bank's calling in the McKenna loan," a man's voice said quietly from the next aisle over. "End of the month, full payment due, or they foreclose on the property." Eleanor pressed herself against the shelves, straining to hear more. "That's a damn shame," another voice replied. "Tom's been making his payments regular-like for years." Dalton's influence, no doubt. Word is he's got financial interest in the bank now. Amazing how quickly the circumstances can change when the right pressure's applied. Eleanor's mind raced as she processed this information. Thomas had never mentioned financial difficulties, but then again, he was a proud man who wouldn't burden others with his troubles. If Dalton couldn't drive them off with violence, he was apparently prepared to use legal means. That evening, Eleanor waited until Samuel was asleep before approaching Thomas on the cabin's front porch. He was carving another wooden animal, a bear this time, his large hands working with surprising delicacy despite the healing wound in his shoulder. "Thomas," she said carefully, settling into the chair beside him, "we need to talk." Something in her tone made him look up from his carving. "About what?" "About the bank loan and Dalton's new financial partnership with them." Thomas's hands went still, the half-finished bear frozen in his palm. In the lamplight from the cabin windows, Eleanor could see the muscles in his jaw tightening. "How did you—" he began, then stopped. "Henderson's store?" "The walls have ears," Eleanor confirmed. "Thomas, why didn't you tell me? If we're going to lose the cabin anyway—" "We ain't losing nothing," Thomas interrupted, his voice hard as the iron he worked. "I got until the end of the month to come up with the money." "How much?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, $800. Eleanor felt her heart sink. It might as well have been 8,000 for all the chance they had of raising that amount. Thomas's workshop was gone, his tools destroyed or damaged. Even if he could find work, there was no way to earn that much money in a week. "There might be another way," she said slowly. Thomas's eyes sharpened on her face. "What kind of way?" Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to suggest would either save them or destroy what fragile trust had grown between them. "Before James died, I taught at Miss Whitmore's Academy for young ladies in Boston. I have connections there, wealthy families who value education and discretion. If I wrote to them, explained our situation—" "You want to beg?" The words came out flat and cold. "I want to survive," Eleanor replied firmly. "Thomas, pride is a luxury we can't afford right now. These people have more money than they know what to do with, and they respected my husband's family name. A loan, not charity." "No." Thomas stood up abruptly, the wooden bear falling from his hands to clatter on the porch boards. "I don't take money from strangers, especially not your fancy Eastern friends." Eleanor rose to face him, frustration and fear making her voice sharper than she intended. "Then what do you suggest? Because from where I stand, our options are limited to begging, borrowing, or—" "Or what?" Eleanor hesitated, then forced herself to say it. "Or giving Dalton what he wants." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations. Thomas stared at her as if she'd struck him, and Eleanor immediately regretted her words. "You think I should sell," he said quietly. "Pack up and run. I think we should consider all our options before we lose everything." Eleanor replied, trying to keep her voice reasonable. Thomas, this land is important to you, I understand that. But it's just land. Samuel and I, we care about you, not the property. Thomas turned away from her, staring out into the darkness beyond the porch. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. You don't understand, Eleanor. This ain't just land to me. This is where I buried my wife and daughter. This is where I planned to grow old with Mary, where Emma was going to play with her own children someday. Dalton don't want this property for cattle ranching. He wants to mine it. Strip away the topsoil, blast through the rock, turn it into a scarred wasteland for the sake of silver ore. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest as she finally understood the true stakes of their fight. This wasn't about money or pride. It was about love, memory, and the sacred ground where Thomas's heart lay buried. I can't let him do that, Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly. I can't let him tear up their resting place for profit. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand in both of hers. Then we'll find another way, she said firmly. Together. Thomas looked down at their joined hands, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. Eleanor, he said softly, you don't owe me this. You and the boy could still leave, start fresh somewhere safe. I got no right to ask you to stay and fight a battle that ain't yours. Eleanor tightened her grip on his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life's work. Thomas McKenna, she said, looking directly into his storm-gray eyes. Don't you understand? This became my battle the moment you offered us shelter. This became my home the moment you showed Samuel how to carve horses from wood. And you, she took a shaky breath, you became important to me the moment you pushed my wedding ring back across that counter and offered me something more valuable than gold. In the lamplight, Eleanor saw Thomas's expression change, the careful walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. When he lifted his free hand to touch her face, his fingers trembled against her cheek. But their moment of connection was shattered by the sound of horses approaching in the darkness and the unmistakable voice of Jeremiah Dalton calling out from the shadows. McKenna, I know you're in there. Time we had ourselves a proper conversation. Thomas was already moving, pushing Eleanor behind him as he reached for the rifle, leaning against the porch railing. In the distance, Eleanor could count at least 6 mounted figures silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Stay inside, Thomas commanded, his voice deadly calm. Get Samuel and keep him away from the windows. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to think clearly. Thomas, there are too many of them. If this turns into a fight, then it turns into a fight, Thomas replied, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. Go, Eleanor, now. Eleanor hurried inside, scooping a sleepy Samuel from his bed and carrying him to the root cellar despite his confused protests. This time, she armed herself with both the rifle Thomas had given her and a shotgun she'd found in his closet. From her hiding place, she could hear the conversation above, Dalton's cultured voice carrying clearly through the night air. Now, Thomas, no need for that rifle. I come in peace, as they say. Just want to discuss your current financial difficulties. Nothing to discuss, Thomas replied, his voice carrying the promise of violence. You and your boys can turn around and ride out the way you came. Dalton's laugh was like ice scraping against stone. Oh, but I think there is something to discuss. See, I had an interesting conversation with banker Hartwell today. Seems your loan payment's due in 6 days, and you're somewhat short of funds. Eleanor pressed her ear to the cellar door, straining to hear Thomas's response. My business with Hartwell is between him and me, Thomas said finally. Ordinarily, yes, Dalton agreed, but when a man's about to lose his property anyway, it seems foolish to refuse a generous offer. I'm prepared to pay off your debt and give you an additional $500. Cash money. All you have to do is sign a deed of sale and be off the property by week's end. There was a long pause, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath. And if I refuse? Thomas asked. Well, Dalton's voice carried a note of false regret. Accidents happen. Men who can't pay their debts sometimes find themselves facing additional pressures. Foreclosure proceedings can be quite stressful. Sometimes folks don't survive the strain. The threat was clear, and Eleanor felt ice form in her veins. Dalton wasn't just threatening Thomas anymore. He was threatening all of them. You threatening my family, Dalton? Thomas's voice had gone dangerously soft. Family? Dalton's tone was mocking. You mean that Eastern widow and the boy? Thomas, surely you don't think a woman like that would stay with a man like you by choice? She's using you for shelter and protection. Nothing more. Once she realizes how dangerous it's become to associate with you, she'll be gone faster than smoke on the wind. Eleanor felt anger flare in her chest like a struck match. How dare Dalton presume to know her feelings or motivations? Matter of fact, Dalton continued, his voice taking on a cruel edge, I might be willing to make separate arrangements for the lovely Mrs. Whitmore. A woman of her qualities could find herself quite comfortable under the right kind of protection. The silence that followed was absolute, and Eleanor realized that Dalton had just made a fatal mistake. When Thomas spoke again, his voice carried the coldness of winter steel. Dalton, he said quietly, you just said the wrong thing to the wrong man. The gunfire erupted suddenly, sharp cracks splitting the night air. Eleanor clutched Samuel closer, whispering reassurances while her heart hammered against her ribs. Above them, she could hear Thomas moving with deadly purpose, the sound of his boots crossing the porch, the solid thunk of bullets hitting the cabin walls. But this time, the fight was different. This time, Eleanor could hear other voices joining the battle, townspeople, shouting encouragement and warnings. Through the crack under the cellar door, she could see the additional muzzle flashes, indicating that Thomas wasn't fighting alone. The battle seemed to last forever, though it was probably only minutes. Finally, the gunfire faded, replaced by the sound of horses retreating rapidly into the night. Eleanor! Thomas's voice called out, rough with exhaustion, but very much alive. It's over. You can come out. Eleanor emerged from the cellar with Samuel in her arms to find their porch crowded with townspeople. Mrs. Henderson was there, clutching an ancient shotgun with grim determination. Doc Warner had brought his medical bag and was examining a graze on Thomas's arm. Even old Pete from the livery stable had come, armed with a buffalo rifle that looked older than he was. About time we stood up to that bastard, Mrs. Henderson declared, her usually proper language forgotten in the heat of the moment. Begging your pardon for the language, Mrs. Whitmore. Eleanor set Samuel down and moved to Thomas's side, her hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. How did you all know to come? She asked. Doc Warner saw Dalton and his boys riding out of town, Mrs. Henderson explained. Figured they were headed here, so we organized ourselves. Been waiting for months for someone to take a stand against that man. Thomas caught Eleanor's eye over the heads of their supporters, and she saw something new in his expression. Hope, mixed with gratitude and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. Dalton's not going to give up, Thomas said quietly to the group. This was just the opening move. Then we'll be ready for the next one, Doc Warner replied firmly. Thomas, you've been fighting this battle alone for too long. Time you let the rest of us help. As the townspeople began to disperse, promising to return the next day to help plan their defense, Eleanor found herself alone with Thomas on the shot-torn porch. In the starlight, she could see the exhaustion in his face, but also something she'd never seen there before. Hope. Eleanor, he said quietly, reaching for her hand, what Dalton said about you using me was complete nonsense, Eleanor interrupted firmly. Thomas McKenna, I'm exactly where I choose to be, with exactly the man I choose to be with. When Thomas smiled, a real smile, the first she'd seen from him, Eleanor felt something warm and bright unfurl in her chest, like a flower opening to the sun. But she also knew that Dalton's threats weren't idle, and tomorrow would bring new dangers that would test everything they were building together. The bank foreclosure notice arrived on a gray October morning, delivered by a nervous clerk who couldn't meet Thomas's eyes. Eleanor read the document over Thomas's shoulder, her heart sinking with each legal phrase. They had 3 days to vacate the property, and Sheriff Morrison would be out to enforce the order if they refused to comply. Hartwell's signature, Thomas observed, his finger tracing the banker's name at the bottom of the document. But I'll bet you $1 to a donut that Dalton was standing right behind him when he signed it. Eleanor studied the notice more carefully. her years of helping James with his business correspondence serving her well. Thomas, look at this date stamp. This was filed 2 days ago, but the payment isn't due until tomorrow. Thomas's eyes sharpened on the document. So they filed the foreclosure before I was actually in default. Which means, Eleanor said slowly, pieces of a plan beginning to form in her mind, they're in violation of the loan terms. Thomas, I need to see your original loan agreement. Thomas retrieved the documents from a strongbox under his bed, and Eleanor spread them across the kitchen table. Her educated eye quickly found what she was looking for. Here, she said, pointing to a specific clause. The bank must provide 30 days written notice before beginning foreclosure proceedings. This notice was filed while you were still current on your payments, which invalidates the entire process. Thomas stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. You saying the foreclosure ain't legal? I'm saying Dalton got impatient and made a mistake, Eleanor replied, feeling a surge of hope. But we need to get to the county courthouse in Helena before Sheriff Morrison shows up. If we can file a challenge to the foreclosure. Helena's a 2-day ride, Thomas interrupted, and Dalton's not going to let us leave peaceful like. Eleanor had already considered this problem. Then we don't leave together. Samuel and I will take the morning stage to Helena. You stay here and defend the property. If anyone asks, you haven't seen us. Thomas's face darkened. I ain't sending you and the boy off alone while... Thomas, Eleanor interrupted, placing her hand over his. This is the only way. You're needed here, and I'm the one with the education to argue legal points with the judge. We can do this, but only if we work together. For a moment, Thomas looked like he might argue further. Then he glanced at Samuel, who was playing quietly with his wooden animals in the corner, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around him. If something happens to you and the boy, Thomas said quietly, I'll never forgive myself. Eleanor lifted her hand to touch his scarred cheek, feeling the roughness of his morning stubble against her palm. And if we lose this fight because we were too proud to take risks, I'll never forgive myself. Thomas, we're partners in this. Trust me. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, the final wall around his heart cracking open. When he covered her hand with his own, Eleanor felt the calluses and strength that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. All right, he said, but you take this. He pressed his father's old pistol into her hands, along with a leather pouch containing ammunition. And you wire me the moment you get to Helena. If I don't hear from you within 3 days, you'll hear from me, Eleanor promised. They spent the rest of the morning preparing for the journey, packing light but taking every document that might be useful in court. Mrs. Henderson had agreed to drive them to the stage depot, citing a need to visit her sister in Helena, a transparent excuse that fooled no one but would provide perfect cover. As Eleanor and Samuel prepared to board the afternoon stage, she noticed a familiar figure watching from across the street, one of Dalton's men, pretending to read a newspaper while keeping careful track of their movements. Eleanor's mind raced. If Dalton's spy reported their departure, he might send men after the stage, or worse, use their absence to make his final move against Thomas. She made a quick decision. Mrs. Henderson, she said quietly, I need you to take Samuel on the stage. Tell anyone who asks that I decided to stay home with a headache. Eleanor, Mrs. Henderson began to protest. Please, Eleanor interrupted. Samuel will be safe with you, and I need to get back to Thomas. This is a trap, I can feel it. Mrs. Henderson looked at the watching spy, then at Eleanor's determined face and nodded grimly. You be careful, dear. That man across the street isn't the only set of eyes watching us today. Eleanor kissed Samuel goodbye, whispering promises that she would see him soon, then slipped out the back of the depot while the stage pulled away with its valuable cargo of documents and one frightened little boy in Mrs. Henderson's capable care. The ride back to the cabin seemed to take forever, and with each mile, Eleanor's sense of urgency grew. When she finally crested the hill overlooking their property, her worst fears were realized. Smoke was rising from the direction of the house, and she could see figures moving in the failing light. Too many figures, and none of them large enough to be Thomas. Eleanor spurred her horse forward, her heart hammering with the terrible certainty that she was already too late. Eleanor reached the cabin to find Thomas backed against the front door, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. facing 5 of Dalton's men in a rough semicircle. "Where's the woman and the boy?" Dalton's voice carried clearly across the yard. He stood slightly apart from his men, immaculate as always, despite the violence surrounding him. "Gone," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite his injuries. "Left on the morning stage." "I don't think so," Dalton said with cold amusement. "My man saw them at the depot, but he also saw the woman slip away. So I'll ask again, where are they?" Eleanor's mind raced as she took in the scene from her concealed position behind the barn. Thomas was injured but still fighting, and she could see his rifle leaning against the porch railing where he'd been forced to abandon it. The smart thing would be to ride for help, but there wasn't time. Instead, she did something that would have horrified her civilized Boston relatives. She took careful aim with Thomas's pistol and put a bullet through Dalton's hat. The shot sent the men scrambling for cover, giving Thomas time to dive for his rifle. In the confusion that followed, Eleanor spurred her horse forward, riding straight into the middle of the fight with her pistol blazing. "Eleanor!" Thomas's voice was sharp with alarm and admiration as she wheeled her horse around, forcing Dalton's men to spread out to avoid being trampled. "The documents are safe," Eleanor called back, putting another bullet into the ground near one gunman's feet. "Samuel, too. It's over, Dalton." Dalton's face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully laid trap had failed. "Kill them both," he snarled, but his words were cut short by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Sheriff Morrison appeared over the ridge, followed by what looked like half the men in Dusty Creek. Doc Warner, Pete from the livery, merchants and ranchers and townspeople, all armed and looking grimly determined. "That's enough," Morrison shouted, though Eleanor noticed he was careful to position himself well out of the line of fire. "Everybody put down your weapons!" Dalton's men, suddenly outnumbered 3-1, slowly lowered their guns. But Dalton himself was beyond reason, his pale eyes fixed on Eleanor with murderous intent. "This is all your fault," he snarled, drawing his pistol with lightning speed. "You couldn't just let well enough alone." The shot that cut off Dalton's words didn't come from Eleanor's gun or from Thomas's rifle. It came from the crowd of townspeople, where Mrs. Henderson stood with her ancient shotgun smoking in her hands and a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "That's for threatening children," she said calmly, as Dalton crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The rest of Dalton's men surrendered without further violence, and Eleanor finally allowed herself to breathe. As she dismounted, Thomas caught her in his arms, his large hands shaking as he held her against his chest. "Eleanor," he said roughly, "when I saw you ride into that fight, don't you ever scare me like that again." "I had to come back," Eleanor replied, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I couldn't let you face them alone." Thomas pulled back to look at her face, his storm gray eyes bright with an emotion that made Eleanor's heart race. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said quietly, "I love you. I know I got no right. No, I'm not the kind of man a lady like you should want, but—" Eleanor silenced him with a kiss that tasted of gunpowder and hope and the promise of new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling through tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "Thomas McKenna," she said firmly, "you're exactly the kind of man I want, the only man I want." Around them, the townspeople began to cheer, and Eleanor realized that they had won more than just a battle. They had won a place in this community, a future together, and the right to build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. Sheriff Morrison, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the whole situation, was attempting to restore order. "Now see here, there's still the matter of the bank foreclosure." "Actually," Eleanor said, retrieving the documents from her saddlebags, "there isn't. Dalton filed these papers prematurely, in violation of the loan terms. The foreclosure is invalid." Morrison studied the documents with the slow, careful movements of a man who knew he was being watched by an increasingly hostile crowd. Finally, he nodded grudgingly. "Seems you're right, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll have to notify the bank that the foreclosure proceedings are void." Dalton, now being tended by Doc Warner, looked up from his bandaged shoulder with eyes full of venom. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll appeal this decision. Bring in federal marshals if I have to." "Actually," Doc Warner said cheerfully, "it is over. While you were busy playing with guns and bank documents, I had a very interesting conversation with the territorial governor about your business practices. Seems there's been some questions about the legality of your land acquisition methods. Federal marshals are indeed coming, but they're coming for you." The fight went out of Dalton like air from a punctured balloon. As Morrison's deputy led him away in handcuffs, Eleanor felt the last of her fear dissolve. Thomas's arm tightened around her as they watched their enemy being taken away, and Eleanor knew that their real story was just beginning. 3 months later, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the rebuilt workshop, watching Thomas shape red-hot iron with the same patient skill he brought to everything in his life. The new forge was larger than the old one, built with help from half the town and designed to accommodate the increased business that came with being the only blacksmith for 50 miles who had stood up to Jeremiah Dalton and won. The workshop rang with the sound of hammer on anvil, a rhythm as steady and reassuring as a heartbeat. Samuel sat on a wooden stool nearby, his own small hammer in hand, as he practiced on a piece of scrap metal. Thomas had been teaching him the basics of metalwork, and the boy had taken to it with enthusiasm. The hollow, frightened look had been replaced by the confident bearing of a child who knew he was loved and protected. "Aunt Eleanor," Samuel called out, noticing her in the doorway, "look what Thomas taught me to make." Eleanor examined the bent piece of iron that was supposed to be a horseshoe nail, praising Samuel's efforts with genuine warmth. In the months since Dalton's arrest and trial, Samuel had begun to bloom like a flower after rain. He laughed more, spoke freely, and had started calling Thomas Uncle Thomas without any prompting from the adults. Thomas set down his hammer and crossed to where Eleanor stood, his large hands settling naturally on her waist. Despite the passage of time and the depth of their relationship, Eleanor still felt a thrill at his touch. "How was town?" he asked, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Eventful," Eleanor replied, reaching into her reticule to pull out an official-looking document. "The territorial governor's office has some interesting news about our former nemesis." Thomas raised an eyebrow as he read the document. 20 years in federal prison for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Well, I'll be damned. "Thomas," Eleanor scolded, glancing at Samuel. "Sorry," Thomas grinned, not looking particularly repentant. "I'll be danged." Eleanor laughed despite herself. Living with Thomas McKenna had taught her that some rules were worth breaking, and some words were just words, while some actions spoke louder than any vocabulary. The wedding had taken place 6 weeks after Dalton's final defeat in the small church at the center of Dusty Creek. Eleanor had worn her mother's dress, altered to fit her changed circumstances, and Thomas had scrubbed himself pink and managed to squeeze into the only suit in town that came close to fitting his massive frame. Mrs. Henderson had cried through the entire ceremony, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd seen since her own wedding 40 years earlier. Doc Warner had provided the music, his violin playing surprisingly sweet for hands, more accustomed to setting bones and delivering babies. Now, as Eleanor looked around their rebuilt life, she marveled at how much had changed since that desperate moment when she'd offered her wedding ring for bread. She still wore that ring, but on her right hand now, while Thomas's grandmother's wedding band graced her left. Some symbols were worth keeping, even when their meaning changed. "I have other news," Eleanor said, taking Thomas's hand and placing it over her still flat stomach. Doc Warner confirmed it this morning. Thomas's eyes widened, then filled with a joy so pure and bright that Eleanor felt her heart swell with love. When he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, she laughed with the sheer happiness of being exactly where she belonged. "We're having a baby?" Samuel asked, looking up from his metalwork with interest rather than jealousy. "We are," Eleanor confirmed, reaching out to ruffle his hair. "Are you ready to be a big brother?" Samuel considered this seriously. "Will I have to teach him to make horseshoe nails?" "Or her," Thomas corrected gently. "And yes, if you want to." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Eleanor reflected on the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. Loss and desperation had driven her to Dusty Creek, but love and determination had made it home. She had learned to shoot straight, to stand her ground, to fight for what mattered. Thomas had learned to trust again, to open his heart to new love without betraying the memory of old. Samuel had learned that families could be built as well as born, and that home was wherever people loved you unconditionally. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Frontier life never was. There would be harsh winters, difficult births, the endless challenge of making a living from the unforgiving land. But they would face it together, the three of them, soon to be four, surrounded by a community that had chosen to stand with them when it mattered most. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through Eleanor and Thomas's story. If this tale of love, courage, and second chances touched your heart, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more amazing stories from the Wild West and beyond. Share in the comments below what you thought about Eleanor's brave decision to fight for her new family, and let me know which frontier romance you'd like to hear next. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love to conquer even the wildest frontiers.